With that, it is 4 o'clock. See people from Canada, the US, London, Colombia. I think we're sort of all over the place. Okay, yeah, let's start. So, Jan Kees, welcome this presentation about building a financial business case for L&D in a time of recession. And I know you're the right person to talk about this because you're now the CEO of Easygenerator. Before that, you were the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer of KPN, which is the largest telco in the Netherlands. And before that, you were the Minister of Finance. So welcome, and maybe you can do your own short introduction, Sal.
Okay, well, yeah, happy. Well, I think the most relevant part you already mentioned. I think the credibility for this presentation would be probably former Chief Financial Officer of KPN, a publicly listed company, and former Finance Minister of the Netherlands. But now, of course, much more important, we are one of the founders of Easygenerator in the past, before I went to the politics, and now very happy to have resumed my original entrepreneurial career at Easygenerator. And yeah, thanks for the introduction, Casper. So let us move to the takeaways of this presentation. Is the screen shared now? Because I still see Casper.
Right now, just give me a sec. I will share my screen now. So now everybody should be able to see your presentation. And just point to the next page.
Yeah, that's already, yeah, you can already take us to the next slide. So the takeaways for this presentation is how can you profit from a global recession and engage your CFO during difficult times? Why employee-generated learning is the most sustainable type of learning. We also have business cases and examples of that by means of Casper as well. And what customer gain from actually adopting employee-generated learning, also in the business cases, in practical business cases. So it is very important to know, and you can see that also on the back on the next slide, that there will be always a recovery from a global recession. So we are, and that's the consensus of almost everybody, we are heading into, if not already in, a recession at the moment. Maybe not a very deep one, we still not know, but it could be a little bit prolonged one. There are several analysts about that. But let's first look at the history of recessions. It's interesting always to look, if you want to look forward, always learn from the history. And from this graph, we see about 150 years of economic development, of growth in global heads per GDP. And the world, of course, has faced numerous crises in this period. But interestingly is that what we see that the COVID downfall of the economy, the contraction during COVID, actually was the largest contraction since we are measuring, besides the second, you could say because the world wars are a little bit more, you cannot see that here in this graph, but a little bit more than that. But the COVID contraction was a very, very strong contraction in world economic history. But you also see a very sharp recovery as well. So we are now at the very high recovery point, a very sharp downwards and a very sharp recovery. This is a typical V-shaped recovery, which is actually quite typical for a pandemic or any crisis, a short-term crisis, also if we look at in the past. However, now it seems that we are heading into a more uncertain period following the recovery of the pandemic because of the war situation in the eastern part of Europe, the continuous COVID situation in some parts of Asia. So the global energy crisis and commodities that have been become very expensive also to produce in the West further goods. So we have seen a lot of recent uncertainty this year added to the post-pandemic recovery, which means also that it is very likely that we are going into a recession. And a very typical answer in a recession is always to cut your budget, which is understandable because you are in survival mode. But what we have seen from the last recession, many companies that laid off a lot of people during their downfall, the strong downfall, were having a lot of difficulty in getting back talent again after getting out of this crisis. So in a sharp recovery, as we have seen in the post-pandemic era, it was super difficult and very costly for many companies or organizations to recover from the layoffs that they did and again hire new talent. And the ones that actually retained talent, retained resources, or were very early to grow again in resources, were the ones best off, because the ones late in that game on the recovery cycle in the economy were not doing very well. Because they were entering into a super competitive labor market and already most of the talent was already hired. So it was a very difficult situation. That is interestingly, let's go to the next slide. That is interestingly because today we are talking about the about investing in learning and development during a crisis. And also when you look back, for example, during the 2008-2009 crisis, there is overwhelming evidence that companies that have invested in learning and development during that crisis have seen much better performance financially than during the companies that did not invest and only cut their budgets in the 2008-2009 crisis. And that evidence of past crises, also with the experience, which is much closer by the experience that we have seen in the post-pandemic recovery, that the ones that laid off too quickly or were late in rehiring were having a lot of difficulties in recovery because the talent was not there anymore. So that experience, that recent experience of the post-pandemic recovery, and added to the somewhat longer crisis that we have seen in 2008, 2009, 2010, that actually companies that continue to invest in L&D did much better than their competitors, is a very interesting point to make to your C-level suite in your company, to the CEO and the CFO. So if we go to the next slide, we can say that there are many reasons, and we will go into that later, that it is important to keep investing in your people also during the lows in an economic situation. And even there is now a more compelling argument compared to only the 2008-2009 evidence that we see that during crisis it's best to keep investing in people and keep investing in L&D. Also the recent recovery, the very sharp recovery of the pandemic, and as a result of that, the difficulty of getting in the talent or retaining the talent before that, underlines that. But there's also, so if you know that you don't want to lay off all your people because you have to retain some of them, it's interesting because then you have a two-sided sword, actually, that you retain some talent because you want to have enough talent at the time of recovery, and you have capacity to share knowledge because those people have a lot of knowledge in your company. So you want to retain them and at the same time capture that knowledge. And at the same time, employees have also a bit more time to spare to learn as well. So there are employees. So if you do not want to immediately lay off all your capacity and retain some part because the recent evidence is there that you do not want to lay off a lot of people during the crisis, not everybody, because you need them again on a recovery. You have some time left for those people because not everybody is utilized to the maximum. Use that time, utilize that time for those people that retained all that knowledge for years and years, some even decades in your company, use that time that they capture that knowledge and can also transfer that knowledge to new generations, to new employees. That takes a little bit of time, but not that much. And also your employees have time to learn as well. And the interesting point, of course, is then you really are at the sweet spot of employee-generated learning, because that means you are best off with a tool that doesn't cost you extra out-of-pocket cost, but utilizes the time that you already have spare in your organization to capture the knowledge that is there, to capture for the knowledge of years and years and even sometimes decades in organization, to bring forward for the new generations, for the new years to come. So if we could go to the next slide, we see that companies with full training programs generate 218% more income per employee than those who don't. That's very significant. That's very significant. It's research by the ATD, Association for Talent Development, and it's a very significant metric that you also can utilize in the business case. We come later to that for your C level of management, your CFO and your CEO, because that's typically, as added with the other arguments that I gave, a very important point. Let's go to the next slide, because having all that knowledge about how to make it better for your company and how to utilize even a recession into your own benefit to improve L&D, improve learning and development, and to actually utilize the time that will be freed up to capture a lot of the knowledge so you can secure it for the next generation of employees. Of course, you need a business case and you need to engage your C-level. And a very good way to start is at your CFO. Your CFO and your CEO are basically looking for the same thing. They're very much normally aligned on strategic, but also on cost goals. And how to engage your CFO is a very important point. And I've been for almost 6 years CFO, and before that, I was almost 6 years the finance minister and Secretary of State of Finance in the Netherlands. So I have worked in that capacity and I know how these business cases work. And it's very important, and I cannot stress this enough, it's very important that even when your CFO asks you to cut spend, to cut budget, actually, that's not his main concern. Of course, a CFO always likes to see lower cost and increase the bottom line. Your top line is your revenue, then you have your costs, and the bottom line is everything what remains after deducting operational spends. But actually, the CFO is even more concerned about value creation. That's the main thing. So let's go to the next slide. Value creation is extremely important. What your CFO is targeting at, more important even than cost cutting. Cost cutting is also important. And then, of course, it is very helpful that employee-generated learning, by the way, is typically comes at a much lower cost, a much lower spend than your normal formal learning process, both in time utilized, but also in out-of-pocket costs to external parties. But it's more than that. It's not only the cost benefit that employee-generated learning can bring you during a recession. It's mostly about the value generation you can make. And creating value, especially during times of crisis, is actually what the CFO looks at. So here we see a quadrant that Easygenerator made. We are you could say the inventors of employee-generated learning. We started many years ago with that model. And you see in your top left, you see that everything started with, in history, with formal learning. We have done that for hundreds of years, actually thousands of years. Everything what we did in human history normally started with formal learning. Teachers that were teaching their knowledge, transferring the knowledge top down from the one that has knowledge and uses its time to educate other people. But interestingly enough, also in history, there was, especially when we are talking about skills, for centuries, there was a very strong, in arts and crafts, for example, a very strong different type of peer-to-peer education as well. And it was much more already avant la lettre, you could say, before the 20th century started and Easygenerator started, really employee-generated learning, doing it online. You already had the apprentice model, and not with a formal teacher, but with a person that had a very good ability, a very good skill in painting or in crafts or in making sure horses were right, and etc. In centuries, there was also a model of apprenticeship and learning the way of from your peers. And this is what happened in what actually in the beginning of the 21st century happened when we moved slowly from formal learning again, because at some point in time we did away with that. We did away with the apprenticeship, and everything was put in schools and formal learning, etc. And the 20th century was an industrialization, and a lot of things happened. And one of the things, we lost a little bit of the art of apprenticeship that was there before in the arts and crafts period of the Middle Ages until the 18th and even 19th century. But now in the beginning of the 21st century, you could say in a very modern way, we invented that model of knowledge transfer, and Easygenerator contributed to that with the employee-generated learning. And we made it because we were the first one really to emancipate that model, that we made a tool so easy to use, like with the ease of PowerPoint, that you can use every subject matter expert, every person in a company that carries knowledge, that has knowledge, that can use some of its time, his or her time, to transfer knowledge by means not in the old-fashioned way, to one person to a person, but in e-learning, much more efficient and much more effective. So hence, the era of knowledge transfer came into place. And that was a very defining moment of a tool that was so easy, so super easy to use, that we could use the persons that actually have the knowledge, that is from a day-to-day does the certain tasks or is involved or tasked for that task in a company, is able to use a tool to capture their knowledge, to transfer the knowledge into an e-learning course. In a matter of a few hours, you can already create course content as a subject matter expert. You don't need the formal way of learning again anymore. And then also we are gradually, besides knowledge transfer, which will still remain very important, by the way, also formal learning will still be there in, for example, very top-down compliance courses, language learning, teaching accounting methods that do not change that much over time. But everything that is, every content, every knowledge that has some specific skill set or is time sensitive is ideal for employee-generated learning and knowledge transfer. It's a long tail of the e-learning is actually there in that part where employee-generated learning is much more efficient and much more effective than in the short tail of formal learning, which will still be there. But knowledge, these quadrants do not replace each other. You could say they add each other on top of each other. So after knowledge transfer, now we see more and more also performance support happening as well. And that is something that is it's not about what you know, you could say, but what you can do. And learning-centric organizations, again, will really outperform competitors and will do better for all the stakeholders, clients and employees. So content used for performance support could be and should be created by the employees typically, because they know best, much better than formal outside people outside of the company, the ones that normally generate more the formal learning, which is again still there also, but that's a typical different type of learning part. And now we are exactly talking, and Casper will talk about that later in the business cases, which is the sweet spot of Easygenerator. Content used for knowledge transfer and performance support should be created by employees because they are the best for that type of content. Again, formal learning is still there, and there's a lot of fields at formal learning. The short tail of e-learning that is one to very, very many. But for specific knowledge transfer, for time-sensitive knowledge transfer, and for performance support, that it will remain important. And the responsibility of creating learning content moves more towards the employees because they are really the subject matter experts. Yeah, let's take us to the next slide. So here, again, if we use that knowledge about where the market is coming from, formal learning to new ways where employee-generated learning is much better. There is always in a recession, I know that myself in KPN always, when there is a recession and you have to cut budget, the first thing is always learning that they will look at. Not maybe the first thing, but one of the first things. So one of the first things is always the learning. But you can build very easily a business case that maybe for the formal learning, you can still continue the courses that you already have done and then, well, put a little bit of a break on developing the new formal learning there. But there is a lot of value to be created using a more modern, a more novel way of employee-generated learning for knowledge transfer and performance support. So how do you engage your CFO? You have to know, and your CEO, you have to know the language of the C-level people. And first of all, it's super important to lead your C-suite into a value creation agenda. I will come to that later. Align learning investment with your business goals and strategy, and achieve higher level output by leveraging existing talent. Let's start with the first point. Lead your C-suite in a value creation agenda. The next slide, Casper. Rather than only cost cutting, it is about value creation in the end. So yes, on the short term in survival mode, cost cutting is super important. And again, by the way, typically employee-generated learning is also much more cost efficient than formal ways of learning because you're utilizing your sources already there. And especially during a crisis, you have always some redundant resources and some redundant time, which you can utilize to the maximum of utilize that time for employees to capture and transfer and share their knowledge. And you want, of course, a future-proof model. So yes, you want to be in survival mode, but the CFO also wants to have some looming future positive perspective in the future on how to go forward after the crisis. And again, the post-pandemic recovery is a great example of that. That happened very sharply. Not sure if in this case it will be also so that like a sharp recovery like that, but there will be recovery always after a recession. And you have to think, as CFO has to think about that as well. And employee-generated learning is much more agile. You can adapt much more easy. It's more cost effective. It was already much more cost effective before any crisis, even if you do not have spare time at your employees. And during times, challenging times that you have spare time, it's ideal because it's almost at zero marginal cost or at zero marginal cost. You could capture and create a lot of knowledge. At almost zero marginal cost because you want to keep some of the resources, you don't want to lay off everything, and you can utilize those resources in times of crisis. And the ones that keep investing in a recession, we saw that in 2008, but there's also already enough anecdotal evidence about that in the pandemic as well. The ones that did that are much better off during the recovery time. And so keep the main focus on value rather than only cost. And of course, always think about present the case that costs less money because employee-generated learning is cost effective, but make them love your agenda of value creation. And that is where you really, I think you will reach out to the CFO in his head by the cost aspect, but you will win his heart by a value creation agenda that you can easily make a business case. Later on that, also on the side of Casper, some examples. You can easily make business cases that do that. Let's go to the next slide. If you look at what CEOs want, they almost want the same thing as CFOs. But it's interesting. There's a huge misalignment in what is measured into an organization and what they feel, what CEOs answer on the question that is measured. This is measured by the ROI Institute. And there's the two by far biggest misalignments are impact and ROI. ROI is return on investment. And there you see that impact is said by CEOs in the surveys. Only 8% says it's currently measured, but there's 96, almost everybody says it should be measured, so huge misalignment. And our ROI is 4% versus 74%. Still a huge misalignment on what is measured and what should be measured. So typically a lot of L&D cases have a kind of, you could say, an approach that is purely qualitative, which is of course good. But here, both CEOs and CFOs want to have a little bit more substance. And we gave already some sources for that. We can also offline after the people can, for some of the sources, we can also refer later to the underlying documents, but you can also find out your own ROI in your company. If you see, especially, of course, time spent of employees versus the cost that they will do. But you see that companies that have, by the way, this measured better, they also, that's not a surprise, are outperforming their competitors as well. So what the CEO and the CFO really want is you are able to measure better impact and return on investment in your business case. And I know it's difficult, but impact already can be measured by also surveying qualitative, by asking all the respondents of your company that did the e-learning courses. And return on investment is actually not that difficult. In the Q&A, we can talk about it more if you want some examples on how you measure ROI in a business case on e-learning. But there are actually quite, you could say, easy basic points on how to put that into a spreadsheet that also CFO really understands. It's typically not done for L&D developments, but I really urge that it should be done much more, especially on impact and ROI. All points here are important, but look at the misalignment. So this, you will really conquer the hearts of the CEO and the CFO if you're able to measure ROI and impact in your business case. Then second point is align learning investment with your business goals and strategy. And then the next slide. If you, it's super important. The organization, I don't know what your purpose is and your long-term goals and your short-term goals, but there are targets for next year. Later, maybe a little bit later for the next budget, and there are already long-term strategies in place. Refer also in your business case to that. I've seen a lot of business cases in my past, presented also by L&D departments that were not specifically related to short-term targets and long-term strategies. It really should be done. And learning should be about impact behavior. And behavior should be aligned with business goals. There's also a lot of evidence supporting that as well. And if you're able to connect that in your presentation, there's, together with the points that are already addressed, there's already a much better relation for the CEO and the CFO to understand. And then thirdly, the next slide, achieve higher output by leveraging existing talent. Companies always change, especially in recession. There will be more changes in the future. That is for sure. That is the certainty. That is the absolutely certainty that we know. That's the thing that doesn't change. That change will always be there. And changing workforce involves also huge hidden cost. Attrition is normal. And we have seen the last 2 decades that it's becoming more and more, and people are shorter in their life cycles also at companies. In the last 2 and 3 decades, we have seen that also in big organizations, but also in smaller organizations. So the cost of onboarding people, new people, the benefit of transferring knowledge of the previous generation to a new generation of workforce is more important than ever, because we see shorter cycles of workforce happening in all types of organization. So the training the existing workforce is a much more cost-effective thing than any other expenditure you can imagine. And this is typically undervalued in organizations, that the change in behavior of employees, of becoming less involved in organizations or shorter involved in organizations, and if they stay, even if they stay in the organization, they want to move up quicker. They are the Gen Z generation, but it was already the millennials. They are impatient. They want to move up the ladder, and if they cannot do that in the company, they will go out. But even if they move out up in the ladder within an organization, especially if they move out, there's a lot of transformational cost of that. And e-learning, and especially employee-generated learning, is really the sweet spot to address that issue on how to transfer knowledge from generation to generation of workforces. And that was maybe a generation of workforce could have been 10 years or 20 years, 40 years back. And now it is only a few years. People are very quickly in changing jobs, and also within an organization to change jobs as well. So it is super important to keep working on your current workforce and make, with that transformation, onboarding time shorter, more cost effective, and transfer knowledge much faster. And also the capturing of knowledge with your current workforce that is going away much quicker than in the past. Capturing of that knowledge by means of an employee-generated tooling like Easygenerator, which is easy to use, has become much more important than in the past. Okay, then I hand it back to Casper for for what types of learning generates the most value.
Yes, thank you. So if we look at that, we see that there are different kind of types, and we will focus on 3 of them today. So employee-generated learning is one of them.
Casper, are you in? Are you also in picture?
Yes, I am. I should be.
Oh, I see only myself. Okay, but that's fine. Yeah, thank you.
Setting in Zoom.
Okay.
That you can do. So the second one is bespoke e-learning, so content created for specific purposes by instructor designers. And the third one is classroom training. So we'll dive in a bit deeper into all of them. So starting with classroom training. So a lot of things are changing currently around classroom training. And of course, the whole COVID pandemic was a big boost for that. So a lot of training that was happening in the classroom was not possible anymore during COVID. So a lot of that training has been moved to the web. And the reason for that, of course, was then the pandemic and not being able to meet. But now organizations find that there's also a lot of benefit there moving away from this classroom training, because classroom training is not really agile. It keeps employees off work. It is quite expensive because you have to bring everybody in same location together. It can be rather slow depending on how it is. You cannot self-pace it, so everybody has to follow the same thing. So a lot of companies sort of stick to the online training and move away from the classroom training because the value is a bit there. And what we also see happening a lot is that people go into a blended mode, go back to the classroom for soft skill training or the application, but put the knowledge part in an e-learning course. So classroom training is the first one. And what you see is that if you move to online training, Brandon Hall tells us that it will save you between 40 and 60% over face-to-face learning. Forbes will tell us that online learners retain 25 to 60% higher than face-to-face learners. By the way, that is if you do it in a proper way. So that is a connotation with that. And what you also see is the outcome of a research that was done. So what kind of learning delivery methods are expected to increase in the next year and a half. And then you see that self-paced e-learning is the biggest, together with mobile learning, which is, by the way, really closely connected. And then coaching, video, instructor-led training, it's all done. And classroom-based instructor-led training is on the lowest end of things there. So things are moving more towards self-paced learning and less to classroom training. So then go into bespoke e-learning. And I have been myself responsible for the creation of bespoke e-learning for a long time. And there are a couple of issues there. So if you look at the process on how bespoke e-learning is created, you will see that usually the learning and development department with an instructor designer is responsible for the creation of a learning courses or other learning material. And in order to get to build the training, they have to go to the business side to get the information, because the training is usually about a business topic. They don't know about that, so they have to interview people. So they talk to certain experts, employees, to get that information. They have to go back, put it in a course, check in with the certain experts, make sure that they solve any conflicting input. And that process going back and forth will take a lot of time. And with that, it will also take a lot of money, because it can take up to 240 hours, research shows, to create 1 hour of relearning. And the cost will be something between $10,000 and $30,000. So we can say that the creation of bespoke e-learning is slow, and it is also expensive. But there is a bigger problem, because the instructor designer is the one who is responsible for the creation of learning content and also for the publication. So when he's done, he will publish it in a learning management system, the LMS, and there the learner can go in and take the course. The problem is that the instructor designer is not connected to the business, but the instructor designer is responsible for keeping the course up to date. The course describes a business situation, and that will change over time. Sometimes the course is even outdated when it's being published, but if you don't update it, it will be outdated within weeks, if not, or maybe months, but in very short periods. And because of the disconnect between the instructor designer and the business development, all e-learning content will be outdated in no time. So basically, that led us to the conclusion that we spend a lot of time and money teaching people outdated content. And that is what we don't like, and that is what we want to solve at Easygenerator. So what we did is something very simple. We created the idea of employee-generated learning, the third category. And then the key thing there is that the subject matter expert, the employee, creates the content. And that is necessary because they're the only ones that can do that from a business perspective. And we found it is way faster and way cheaper to do it that way. So up to some 5 to 10 times faster and cheaper. So it's faster and cheaper, but more importantly, once the course is being published, they are, if they are responsible for the course, they are aware of changes in the business, so they can go into the course, edit it, press update, and the course is still live. So making a subject matter expert or a group of subject matter experts responsible for training material and e-learning courses is the only way to do it faster, cheaper, and make content that actually lives, that can be maintained. And is there then no role at all for the instructor designer? That's not true. There is. They can do anything they want. So they can initiate a course. They can help design a course. They can even co-author a course. They can coach a subject matter expert. They can do whatever they want, as long as they don't take over the responsibility for the creation and the maintenance. That is the key thing of employee-generated learning. So, and with that, we see that employee-generated learning has the most value. If you look at this graph, there's a long tail of needs. So basically, on the left, you see courses with a huge internal demand. For example, if you look at compliance training, security training, everybody in your organization has to take that. And those courses that are on the left side of this graph usually are created top down by learning and development. So, but the more that you go to the right, what you see happening more and more in the business is that a smaller group of employees actually need a certain training. So there is a specific pocket of people in a country or specific specialists that want a certain training, and that is just also too small for L&D to create. And there is where employee-generated learning comes in. So the whole right part of this graph is where employee-generated learning really thrives. And here in the slide it says it can take up to 60 to 70% of the total learning needs in an organization. We'll look at an example of Danone. They actually claim it's 95% of their content is being created by employees. So that is a really, really important shift. So this long tail needs to tell you that courses that are like have a huge impact on everybody, really strategic courses taken by all the employees, they still should be top-down learning L&D generated. You also have to track and trace that because you can be audited on that, things like that. But the smaller the amount of learners comes, the better it is to move to an employee-generated learning approach. So if we summarize those arguments, we see that online training saves 40 to 60% overtraining. From Brendan Hall comes that number. As I said, so 1 hour of e-learning costs approximately between $10,000 and $30,000. I rounded it up. So, and that's because it will cost between 80 and 240 hours. Depending on the cost of the hours, you will get numbers like this. Maintenance of bespoke e-learning is almost impossible because there's a disconnect from the business. So a disconnect from the instructor designer who's responsible for the course with the business. And with an employee-generated learning approach, you can extract a lot of value from those long-tail requests. So those courses with smaller audiences. So that is sort of the stage that our customers are working on. And from there, you can see that will drive a lot of changes. So for L&D, it's actually a huge change. So instead of just creating courses, they are now much more in guiding and coaching employees. So instruction design knowledge in the L&D department is still being used to coach the subject experts to create better courses. So they are involved in activating and engaging the subject experts, as I said, working together with them, coaching them, mentoring them, helping design it. And it will free up time for them to spend more time on strategic projects. So in the end, this can be a huge shift for instruction designers and L&D. But if you look at it, you can create a much more impactful role because with your knowledge, you can steer way more people and have impact on way more courses, and you free up time to work on strategic projects at the same time. So I want to take a dive into 3 business cases for employee-generated learning: Danone, BHP, and T-Mobile. So Danone is the first one, and they actually using Easygenerator to learn at the speed of the business, and they do that by really embracing a knowledge-sharing culture. So on the screen you see Frederic. He is the head of digital learning, and he is really driving it forward. And what they achieved at Danone is quite incredible. In a relatively short time, they now empower 1,000 employees to create learning content, and that saves them a lot of time and a lot of money. And also, by the way, gives them better content that is better maintainable. So with Danone, it's a really big success story. And there's a really interesting thing there. So Fred has a technical background. So, and if you look at what he is building, that is an architecture that we see happening a lot. So on the left, you see the HR department and the line up to the 5% instruction design authoring tools following the LMS. That is sort of the normal path of all schools e-learning development. So initiated by HR and instruction designer creates with a complex instruction design authoring tool content and publish that in an LMS. In their case, that is Cornerstone. And Fred claims that this content will be only like 5% of the total learning content at most. Then there's another flow where subject matter experts create content. So sometimes initiated by L&D, they ask subject matter experts to create content, sometimes initiated by SMEs themselves, and that is being published. Sometimes in the LMS, if it's like a formal course, which is part of that 5%, but mostly it's published in an LXP. And for those who do not know the difference between an LMS and LXP, an LMS is like a TV. So it is pre-programmed, so you have to follow the program of the broadcast. So where you follow on the TV, you have news at 8, a soap at 8:20, and sports at 9. and you have to follow that. You can't change that. With an LMS, it's the same. The L&D department determines for you which course you have to take and when you have to take them. Well, LXP is much more like Netflix. So it's basically the same content, sometimes in a bit smaller chunks, but it's the same content, learning content. The difference is it's not pushed to you. It's just waiting there like it is with Netflix. So if you go to Netflix, you can just search for a series, you can search for a movie and start it whenever you want, and even on which device that you want. So with learning, it's the same. And the content created with Easygenerator, it's like a perfect marriage with an LXP, a learning experience platform. So let's call it the Netflix of learning. So the information is put there, and is waiting until there's a learning need with the learner, and the learner takes initiative to go in and pull that information out. So for the known, by the way, that learning experience platform is Adcast. There are a whole bunch of them out there. But we now see a difference of formal learning happening more and more in LMS and being limited to the LMS, and the vast majority of the content being published through an LXP, the Netflix of learning. By the way, the LRS that you see in the middle stands for Learning Record Store, because learning now takes place in different places. If you want to track and trace it, you can't track and trace it inside your LMS, like most organizations do through SCORM. We have a new standard almost now for 9 years. It's called XAPI. It's the new generation of SCORM, and that is able to track and trace from anywhere. That's the key thing of XAPI. So it can track and trace from a course in the LMS, it can track and trace from XP, or even if you publish an Easygenerator course, you can publish through email or Slack or Teams or whatever you want. It can still track and trace that. And then you need a place where that is stored, and that is a learning record store, which is the LRS, which stands in between. So that's basically the result database. So an LMS for top-down learning, an LRS for the results, and LSP for the bottom-up learning, where the bottom-up learning at the known is something like 95% of the total. Moving to the second one, BHP. So when they started, the risk team was the one that started with Easygenerator. And they actually saved $250,000 with Easygenerator. They were used in creating content, and by the way, that was only in the first year. They were used to create content for part with Instructure Designer, but also for large part with external vendors. And initially, they started looking at Easygenerator because their issue was it was too slow to create that. So the whole process of going to the external vendor, them interviewing the people in the business, and that whole process was even slower than working with their own Instructure Designer. So that was the trigger. But then they started working with Easygenerator. They found that next that it is way faster. It's also way cheaper, because now their learning manager Rob tells us that they spent less than $100,000 in a year to do all their content. And in the old days, if they were making a big security course, that was the amount of money that it was spent on just one course from 1 hour. So because it's way more than the 30,000 that we just mentioned, but very often in this amount, it's also maintenance is taking place and something changes. So you need to go back and need to reactivate, and the whole thing needs to start over again. So that's the amount that they mentioned to us, that the old courses could cost up to $100,000. And that is now the budget for all the learning content at the risk culture and capability department. It's now less than 100,000 a year. So that is like a huge shift and a huge saving of money, and it's way faster, and you can keep it up to date. And then the third one is T-Mobile. So they are using Easygenerator for a while now, and for them it was really about constraining resources. At the time they started using Easygenerator, they were a bit in trouble. It was T-Mobile in the Netherlands that started working with Easygenerator, and they were sort of the third party in the market and not really catching up with the first two, so they were really in trouble. So they didn't have a lot of money, and they found out that with Easygenerator they can create content way faster. So actually they claim that they can create 5 times more training output with only 25% of the resources. So with a quarter of the L&D team, they now create 5 times as much learning content, which is really awesome. And the guy on the screen is Dennis, who's responsible at T-Mobile for this. And he also claims that training is created 10 times faster than in the old process with the whole L&D Instructure Design approach. And now, by the way, T-Mobile in the Netherlands is doing way better because they got a huge investment. They bought a couple of other parties, so but it is still growing. So it is no longer only driven by cost and capacity and money, they also see that it's the way better way to create content, and the quality of the content is really, really good. So they can now create 5 times more content with only 25% of the resources, and they claim it's 10 times faster. So that is really impressive. So if we put that whole thing in the bigger scheme of things, where we see things happening, then as Jan Kees already mentioned in this overview, the quadrants that we created in the learning diagram, we see things happening from formal learning towards knowledge transfer, but also, and that is also, for example, happening with all the 3 examples I gave, moving to performance support. So where you have learning here, you have like micro learning or workplace learning there. And that is a huge trend. So we see things happening from top down, like the 5% from the known, and 95% of the learning content is below the line. And also, if you talk to the learning managers like Fred, they will claim there's a lot of what they call hidden learning. So learning which is not, or shadow learning sometimes called, learning which is not happening in the learning department or via the learning department or in the learning tools. It's just happening in the organization, and they don't have any sight of that. And all of that learning is in the bottom half of this. So all of that is bottom-up learning. So summary is, for that, I hand over to Jan Kees again.
Yeah, thank you. I will start my video again. Yeah, thank you, Casper, for the great presentation and also the business cases of 3 companies. So our summary: how can you recover from a recession and engage your CFO? We have seen some scenarios in recovery of a recession, and we have also looked at the experiences of recent recessions during the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, but also more recently the recovery of the pandemic.
Sorry.
Let's stay here. We talked about ways on how to engage your CFO. We addressed why employee-generated learning specifically is a very valuable type of learning, and it's not a replacement of formal learning, but especially during these times, very interesting as a concept, even more compelling than ever. And we learned also what customers gained specifically from adopting employee-generated learning. Thanks. So yeah, let's go to the questions and answers. And yeah, of course, start engaging your CFO. And we have created a checklist that can be shared after the presentation that helps you going through some of the builds of a business case.
The checklist, Molly, okay, put in the chat, so you can click that if you want to download that. So there's a question about connected to that, Jan Kees. We don't have a lot of time, by the way, so we need to go quickly. But the question is, you mentioned earlier that in order to convince your CFO, there's a way better business case of organizations investing in learning in the 2008-2009 crisis than afterwards. And 2 people were wondering, is there a data source for that they can actually show to their C-level with that the proof, and is that something that we can share?
Yeah, we will share because we mentioned different points. Some of the resources I mentioned in the presentation, but I think we will make a full comprehensive source, and maybe add a few others as well, because there's actually a lot of during the pandemic new sources created and content. So we will add some links that you can see that have some actually compelling business cases and information, including also the sources of the information that we used. Yeah.
Okay.
We will send that to all the participants.
Okay, perfect. Then a question from Sima: what CEO wants? My guess is it would differ from a product company to a service-based company, and also the domains demands in the market, because simply there are ROIs sources are different. Is that correct? And is it subject to a market risk? So different kind of companies, they will have like different needs there for the CEO,
yes,
CFO level?
Yes, of course. Every company and also production first services is different, but the basics of demographics in the labor market, that we see shorter life cycles of employees, and that we see knowledge is becoming more and more important and also relatively more expensive because shorter life cycles. So it still takes time to train people, and there's a lot of new information and new technology, albeit in services, but also in production cases where there is new software of the updates or new machines in producing. You see that knowledge has become more volatile than ever before. And that is both for services as well as most production companies as well. Even the traditional markets, even producing a car nowadays is like the labor force on a car is more and more a computer savvy labor force, and also maintenance of the car is more and more computer savvy. So your typical maintenance of an old-fashioned combustion engine car, there is a lot of technology and software. A maintenance person becomes more and more not only changing the oil, but more a software person. So also in production, you see that knowledge has become more and more volatile, that people have in the organizations a lot of knowledge that is there to be captured and to be transferred. And in both cases, there's a compelling case for employee-generated learning compared to the old-fashioned way of top-down learning. So I would argue, yes, there's a lot of differences between that, but the basic idea on why employee-generated learning in the context of the 21st century works better than before is valid for both.
Okay, thank you. There's one simple question that I will answer. Somebody missed the explanation for the LRS, which was the learning record store. So it's a database for the results, whether training is done in a learning management system or LXP. So one database where all results are tracked. So we are also at our time. I see that Nelson already joined us. So we will take a 4-minute break, and at the top of the hour, we will restart and then continue with the last presentation of the day from Nelson.